Welcome back, movie lovers, to another installment of Cinematic Realms. I'm your host, John Webster, and with me, as always, is my co-host and fellow cinephile, Amy Blackfire. And we're having a special Knight of Keira episode today. So how you doing, Amy?
I am good, J-Dubs. Those of you that follow me on Twitter know that yesterday I was nursing a hangover all day. But I always time it out so that I'm not hungover on Saturdays, so I'm feeling good today and ready to talk about Keira.
Yeah, well, you have to wait until further on in the stream to get there. Just kidding.
No, I'm sticking to tea today. I learned my lesson. In my nice Sanri mug, by the way, have you seen Sanrixian shop, anyone? Because she's got some amazing Song of Ice and Fire swag. You should check it out. My plug before we get started.
Just real quick, I want to say hi not only to our usuals, but I see a couple new names. I see M. Abrams here. Hello. And Robbie Mason.
Robbie's back with us. Good to see you, Robbie.
Yeah. Thank you guys for stopping by. This is great. I love to, of course, it's great to have people coming back every week, but I also do get a kick out of seeing people who come in, maybe especially Keira fans or fans, of, in the case of today, David Cronenberg, because I think some people know of him. Yeah. Shop at Sanri's store, buy all the stuff.
Buy all the things. I actually just washed up my Targaryen leggings today, so I might put those on, and if they fit, I will post a picture on Twitter. So follow me on Twitter. I don't know. I keep plugging myself. I apologize, everyone. It's kind of my thing.
Really? I haven't noticed this.
Have you seen my blog? Have you seen my YouTube channel? Okay, I'm done, I promise. Oh my gosh, John, I'm so excited to talk about this. You may not know this, John. I was just going to say to those in the chat, I had to read a shit ton of Jung and Freud for all the theory classes I've been in, because if you've ever been in a graduate theory class, it's just, here's a bunch of old white guys talking about what they think women are like. So that was really fun. So I was having some PTSD for this.
Well, actually, I'm happy about that, because most of what I know about Freud and Jung actually comes from this movie. So it's good to have somebody who has a bit more knowledge than I do about.
I wish I could forget it all, John. I wish I could forget it all.
Are you saying this was not a pleasurable experience revisiting that?
I was just screaming patriarchy at the screen constantly. Oh, sorry, guys, drink already. Not even 3 minutes in. I really was, though. I was like, oh my God. Oh, yeah,
I've decided on a new routine, everybody. I mean, I always have both water and orange juice for these streams, but I've decided just for normal, replenishing of my voice, I'm going to go for water. But whenever Amy says the P word, that's when the orange juice is going to come out.
Also, got to give a shout out to our Canadian Knight of Keira over there, Kate, repping the Great White North.
Yeah, I do want to say, sadly, Jared couldn't join us today because, he works in a hospital and stuff. I hear that's kind of important. So we had to.
Also, my condolences, Rob. Being a grad student is freaking hard. It's not enjoyable, but we do it for the degree and the knowledge. So, and then Jenna over here, my BFF since I was 10, she also has taken some classes that have talked about psychoanalysis. So Jenna, you can also drop some knowledge bombs in the chat for us too.
So I'll just start off by for people who haven't seen this movie, which I gather there's there's probably more than a couple, and which is why we appreciate even more you guys tuning in. Okay, Kelly, that's enough.
It's the bit. No, we commit to the bit, John. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, John. I didn't mean to interrupt.
For anybody out of the loop, which maybe there's a couple. Nobody believes that Jared is actually a real, genuine person outside of myself, since he and I agree on so much. And apparently I hire an actor whenever he does come on to play the role of Jared.
Yeah, we couldn't afford him this time, y'all. You know how it is. Times are hard.
So today we're talking about the 2011 film A Dangerous Method, directed by David Cronenberg and starring, of course, Keira Knightley, Michael Fassbender, and Viggo Mortensen as Sigmund Freud, which seems like obvious casting to me. I don't know about you. So this is unique actually, because we've done a few of these Knights of Keira streams now, but usually we come to it where you've seen the film beforehand. Even Colette, you had actually seen a good length of time before that, but you just saw this for the first time. So I'm rather interested just to hear your like initial impressions. How did you like the movie, and was it what you expected?
Yeah, this when did we watch it, John? Was that Thursday?
Yeah.
So John and I did a private Joe Wolf watch together. We were messaging back and forth while watching it. And it was, half of it was what I was expecting because I've seen GIFs, but the other half I was really not expecting it at all. I wasn't expecting to learn about a female founder of psychoanalysis. That is unfortunately something that I have not learned. Anytime it's psychoanalysis week, basically in each theory class, which I've taken at this point 4 theory classes, and every class has a week on psychoanalysis, and we read Jung and Freud and a couple of other white men. And her history has been quite buried. So I was really surprised to have that. I guess I'll get my gripes out just like up front, which is that I would have really enjoyed a movie that is about her and her work rather than her sex life. That being said, really enjoyed seeing Keira Knightley in those scenes. I am human and have human desires as a bisexual woman, and I really enjoyed that. But I did like her kind of like the pushback between Freud and Jung throughout the whole movie. That I was not expecting. I knew that they had kind of a working relationship, but I didn't know that they had such disagreements on certain things. And Jung basically he embodied me when he had that line where he was like, Freud thinks everything's about sex. Like, that's exactly what I think every time I read about penis envy or fear of castration. It's like, okay, Freud, you're obsessed with your member, and a lot of other people are obsessed with their own members, but like that doesn't mean that the whole world and all of psychoanalysis should be built around phallic symbolism, you know? So I really liked the way that Jung kind of pushed back on that a little bit and was saying we're putting ourselves in a corner by focusing so much on sex and sex issues being kind of where all of quote unquote, craziness comes from. And in Keira Knightley's character's case, Sabina, it was true, but that doesn't mean that every single person who has a nervous breakdown, it comes from childhood, sexual stuff.
Yeah, I do want to respond to a couple of those things. First of all, there is a hilarious moment there's a couple hilarious moments, but when when Freud and Jung first meet, and Jung is describing his dream to Freud, there's that moment where Freud just says, I think you should explore the possibility that the log represents the penis.
Yeah, it's like, wow, Freud, no one was expecting that. And also, for those of you that may not know much about Freud, he was obsessed with dream analysis. So that scene was very correct, in that he would just ask people about their dreams and talk about it for hours and hours. Kind of part of psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis specifically, was that your dreams represent your anxieties. You work out your anxieties in your dreams. Everything is like in symbols of something else, which can be true. But sometimes I also just have, dreams about my teeth falling out. And that's just because I am stressed from grad school. Like, it doesn't have to be like a one-to-one exact, I'm afraid of a certain thing. But yeah, that was a funny scene where they were talking about the dream.
Yeah, and Leaf, this would not have been a comfortable group watch. Just saying.
Yeah.
But I do want to say what you said about the film focusing, quote unquote, on Sabina's sex life. But I mean, that was kind of at the core of her problems as to why she was, and there's going to be lots of use of the P word surrounding this, but the fact that she was diagnosed with quote unquote hysteria. Yeah. And so, I mean, that
push
is
it down, Amy, push it down.
So it is a very important element of her story, and the fact that I think the film was exploring the interconnected relationships between her, Jung, and Freud. So I feel like if that's the story you're telling, that angle is kind of, in some ways unavoidable. But I get what you're saying at the same time.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that the affair between Jung and Sabina lasted 2 years of her life. She had a whole career after that, and a very tragic ending. Spoiler alert, guys, but it's history, so it's not really a spoiler. She and her 2 daughters were murdered by the Nazis. I mean, I know this is going to be like a crazy thing to say, but like, F the Nazis. Like, what the heck? They killed so many brilliant people for no reason. Well, they thought they had a reason, but it wasn't a valid one at all. But so she had a very tragic story, and she also had a very important career. And so I understand that they wanted to focus on the personal parts of her life, but we don't even get to meet her husband when she does stop her affair with Jung. We only see her pregnant. We don't see her get to be a mom. These are the kinds of things that if you were focused on the personal life, you could have extended it further. But they focused on 1908 to 1910, this like very specific, sexy time in her life, if you will.
Well, and I do also want to point out that the film is adapted from a stage play, which was called The Talking Cure, which was in turn adapted from a book called A Most Dangerous Method, the story of Jung, Freud, and Sabina Spielrein. So, I mean, the core element of the story is those 3 characters and how they relate to each other. That said, I would not say no to this isn't the typical type of movie you think of as, hey, let's have a sequel. But I would actually love to see Keira portray the rest of Sabina's life and get to explore that. I think that would be a fascinating movie to see.
It's they kind of showed her going through her graduate work, and it shows her talking about her dissertation with Jung. But I just would have, as a female grad student, appreciated showing her struggle a little bit more on the academic side, rather than this affair that she had that in the end, he was an important mentor, and after they ended the affair, he continued to be. So he was actually more important to her overall life as a fellow academic, rather than the dude spanking her. I'm sorry, quite frankly. But that's me. That's what I look for, especially in movies about women, is I want them to have many different aspects of her life being represented. But at the same time, I think a lot of the conversations, because there's the screenplay, which was based on the book, there were a lot of times when it was just Jung and Sabina talking. And those were probably the best scenes as far as writing and considering some of the themes of the movie.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love about this movie. And you'd kind of expect this since it's based on a stage play, but it's really a lot of scenes of, usually 2 characters just talking. And it's brilliantly written. The dialogue is fantastic. And it's just fascinating to watch these characters converse back and forth. There's, I'm trying to think of, parts of the movie that aren't that, but there's, if there are any, they're very, very few. And it's incredibly fascinating just to see these actors get to perform against one another. So,
yeah, and I also find it fascinating, the interactions between Jung and Freud, because Jung married a rich woman. And so whenever they are getting on the boat to America, Jung is like, oh, my wife booked me this nice suite. And he's like, later days. And then Freud is like, mur, 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 which is funny because Freud was certainly a bigger deal at the time. And yet Jung was able to live in much more luxury than Freud was. And Freud had a larger family. So, there was a lot very different. There was somewhat of a difference between their lifestyles. And I think that kind of is a little bit of why they butted heads slightly.
Yeah, I mean, that whole section on the ship where as soon as they board and and they're immediately divided by class, where Jung says, I go this way, you know, sorry, my wife booked the ticket. Like, yeah, sure, dude. You just wanted to stick it to him. So, but we'll get there because that's, you know, later in the film. But yeah, so I guess we can just, as usual, just, you know, sort of work backwards and move to the you know, forward in the film. The film starts off. I do want to make a note because I wrote it down here about the opening credits of this, which take their cue from letter writing, which is very important throughout the film. There's so much, you know, letters being written back and forth between Freud and Jung, and between, you know, Sabina and Freud, and so forth and so on. And so I thought that was an interesting creative choice. Yeah, especially when you could just as easily have had, you know, just sort of your standard opening title, you know, against a black background. But I did like that. And then it starts off on a very extreme note where Sabina is being taken, you know, to the hospital, and you see, you know, what you recognize as sort of the treatment of, you know, of the time and before that time, where they're just dragging her in and treating her like an animal. Do you have feelings on that, Amy?
So, hysteria itself comes from the idea of the histo, like a hysterectomy, having to do with the womb, with the uterus. There's this idea that women are fragile beings and therefore are more prone to psychotic breaks. This does not mean that men were not treated the same way, especially men, women, non-binary, and trans individuals who had mental difficulty, who had handicaps as far as, you know, learning disabilities. So I'm not at all excusing that, but I do want to focus on how women specifically were treated in the in history of psychiatry. Was that it was almost expected that they would go crazy, and you could, as a man, basically threaten your wife with institutionalizing her constantly. If she not doing what your husband said could be considered a form of hysteria, right? Not being obedient. And so when I first saw this, and especially because, you know, her father institutionalized her, I was automatically suspicious, because it was very easy back then for a father, if you were unmarried, or your husband, if you were married, to institutionalize you for nothing or something that is very minor. But what's fascinating about this is that she was being institutionalized by her father because of her father, right? And
yeah,
he never really takes responsibility for his role in driving her to such extremes. It was his physical abuse that had caused her to have such an unhealthy view of sex and sexuality. So I think that seeing that initial scene of her writhing and going nuts, I automatically thought about patriarchal control. You literally see 4 to 6 men, you know, grabbing her, you know, and she's never talking to a female psychologist, right? All the psychologists are men, and even though Jung did help her a lot, I like that she then entered the field herself, because she realized how women were being it was a great disservice to them, the kind of psychoanalysis that was being done. And psychoanalysis itself being so focused on sex, only having men write about it, it would, you know, you would kind of want another perspective, because if you're looking at it strictly as binary, and don't get me started on the binary not even being a thing, but you have man and woman in the traditional sense, and if you're only getting the opinion on sex from one end of the spectrum, then you're going to have holes in your understanding.
There's actually, I do want to say, and you know what, you know, I made the mistake of just trying to look at my outline and follow that. I think we're just going to jump around a whole lot on this one.
I'm anti-outline.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just talk.
Yeah.
It's the talking method. Oh, I did
sorry
want to
that
say,
I'm
though,
sorry that I'm trying to be orderly, everybody.
hey,
Okay.
I orderly schedule all of our streams. That's as much order as I need. I was gonna say, John, though, one of the early lines we get is when she sits her down with Jung, And he goes, we're going to talk. And she goes, just talk. And those of you that understand the history of psychiatry know that that was revolutionary at the time. They were shocking people. They were putting people in rooms and they weren't seeing people for days. They had the straight jackets, all sorts of things. So the talking method, right, which is what you said the screenplay was called. Was it The Talking Method?
The Talking Cure.
The Talking Cure. It was revolutionary to think that you could just talk about things and work through your issues that way. Nowadays, luckily, I mean, unfortunately, there still is stigma around psychiatry, but the talking method, right, is considered the talking cure, however you want to say. You talk to your therapist and it's considered the first thing you do, and you also can consider a medication. But back then, it was unheard of. It was all about medication, seclusion, and quite frankly, more abuse to these people who were having psychotic breaks.
Yeah, and an interesting thing to note, as you can see in this picture, the way that Jung interpreted Freud's method was that he opted just to sit behind the patient, whereas he had no idea that Freud was doing, the whole thing with the couch and all that. So that was his understanding of the method, because he was really one of the first people. I think the film says he was the first person besides Freud to actually even use the method. So
yeah, and Stephen has a great point. Digging around in people's brain with a needle was also going on as well. And I think I listened to an episode of last podcast on the left about lobotomies, and they said well into the 50s and 60s they were still going on, unfortunately.
Yeah, it really is so sort of, for lack of a better term, amazing to think that, when he says, we're just going to talk. And as you said, her reaction, talk, that it was so revolutionary. It's, the idea of going, talking with a therapist seems so, so obviously accepted and taken for granted now. It's unbelievable to think that instead they were doing all these other horrific things in lieu of that. So it's when I saw this film, it really kind of took me aback. It's like, really? But yeah. And it's interesting because I really do want to talk about Keira's performance in this whole, early section of the film where, I was listening to the audio commentary, and Cronenberg talks about the fact that Sabina as a character is both trying to sort of vocalize the things that she wants to say, but also bury them deep down, which is kind of the root cause of all her convulsions. And, because, as she says in a subsequent scene, she thinks that she's vile and impure and all this stuff. So she's disgusted at even the thought of the things that she wants to be able to say. So that's kind of what causes, how she acts. And Keira's performance actually got some flack at the time because people said they thought it was too over the top. But if you look at documentation of patients with quote unquote hysteria, it's perfectly authentic. And actually, I remember her talking about the fact that they considered going for a toned down version of it, but they opted for the more truthful interpretation, which I'm so glad they did, because I think it's, I'm always going to argue in my head about what Keira performance I prefer, but I think this is her most daring performance. I think it's the one that she was the bravest in.
Yeah, I think so. Not only did she have to act insane, but she also had to take, at the same time. Okay, you put it up. We're battling for the comment. Yeah, also, I think the accent that she had to put on. And I think also it is a small thing, but it is a part of the story. She is also a Gentile acting a Jewish part as well. Which, if the movie would have gone on with her life, I think a little further down, would have obviously, with World War II and the lead up to that, have become more of a problem. And I actually did want to mention that I did sense some anti-Semitism coming from Freud and Jung when they were discussing what all of the patients had in common, and it was that they were all Jewish females. And Freud kind of seemed to hint at the fact that what are you going to do? Jewish women are just more likely to go nuts, which, you know, I sensed some, I don't know Freud himself in his heart if he was an anti-Semite, but that line definitely came off that way for me.
And Kate, yeah, I know, I always suspected, and you know, it's no reason not to suspect that there was a hint of more than a hint of sexism with, you know, issues raised with her performance. I mean, it's, you know, as if a female actress is supposed to remain, you know, like constantly, you know, beautiful while on screen and all that stuff. I think people just wanted Keira to do her usual thing.
I did not know that, Guilty. So maybe he was like, hey man, my Jewish mother was crazy too. I don't know. But I thought that was interesting that he gleaned on that particular, you know, that particular aspect of their patients. And so I found that interesting. But yeah, so maybe there was no anti-Semitism there. Maybe it's just because he had experience with Jewish people as a Jewish person himself.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that, because I was like, maybe she's saying that he had some sort of self-loathing on his part.
I'm definitely not one to talk about that. But yeah, so I think and Kate is also saying that even though he might have considered himself atheist, I am very close to someone who is Jewish who is atheist, and you can be both at the same time. So he probably saw himself as culturally a part of that.
Yeah, and it's actually a rather large part of the sort of conflict between Freud and Jung, where you know, that's always there. And even though, you know, Jung is, you know, at first he, you know, talked about, I don't see what difference that makes, when Freud says all in our circle here in Vienna are Jews. And I love Freud's comeback to that. He says, that, if I may say, is an incredibly Protestant remark.
Yes.
Which is, you know, not to draw parallels to sort of modern times, but that is echoing like a privilege that Jung has to sort of to say something like that when it's evermost in the minds of those who are, you know, in that circle, who had to deal with that. Like, all of their ideas were always going to come up against that, against the prejudice of them being Jewish. And yeah,
and there's also, I think, at this time, and maybe definitely in modern times and even contemporary times, kind of a suspicion of Jewish professionals, when, you know, they have worked just as hard to get where they are, if not harder. And also the many times people who get higher degrees, you know, are Jewish, and they education is very important. Just like when I was in, you know, those of you that know me know that I'm getting PhD in Chinese. All of my Chinese friends, it's very encouraged in their culture to get educated and achieve higher quote unquote success, whatever that means.
Hi, Danny.
Hey, Danny. So there is kind of this anti-Semitic view that, you know, that there are people who are Jewish in the upper echelons of society pulling the strings. And so whenever Jung said that, that's kind of what it evoked in my mind, for sure.
Yeah, I do actually want to go back in the chat a little bit and bring up Kate's point. And this is actually something that I learned from listening to the director's commentary today, where David Cronenberg acknowledges that that Jung's wife also pursued psychoanalysis, and they originally had thought of introducing that in the final scene, but they thought that was a little late in the game to be introducing that, because they couldn't really do much with it at that point, so they opted to leave it out. But, you know, it's another symptom of, you know, even though Sabina is clearly one of the leads, you're also focusing on, you know, predominantly on sort of two male characters. It's like, you know, maybe we can make time for more than just our one female protagonist.
Yeah, and especially because she was tied into, so they're going to focus on this affair, right? let's say that's, oh, well, we wanted to focus on the affair, then focusing more on the woman that's being cheated on would be a good idea as well, because she's also being harmed by this. And I see this a lot too, especially with women of this time, which is that when they know that their husband is cheating on them, but kind of see it at, they have to unfortunately accept that and see it as long as I'm the main wife, right? As long as we're still have our domestic life, then that's okay, as long as she is essentially a concubine, if you will. That happened a lot in pre-imperial China, where you'd have the principal wife, and oftentimes she would only get jealous of one of the concubines when her husband was starting to spend more time with the concubine, right? And starting to treat her like a secondary wife. So I think that if you noticed, Emma, his wife kind of seemed to have a little bit of confidence in their relationship, but her main concern, get ready, was that she hadn't given him a son yet. And so she of course was seeing everything through this lens of the patriarchy. So it would have been really nice to see her as more of a professional moving forward. So I think Kate's comment is really important when we talk about this movie, which is that you had two female professionals in there, and you barely saw the work of one of them, and you saw none of the second. Whereas we got to see, minutes and minutes of Freud and Jung talking about psychoanalysis. Where are the women talking about psychoanalysis?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point.
And that just made me mad when she had the daughter and was like, "Oh, it's the wrong sex." It's like, so much rage.
And that's a product of the time as well.
The internalized misogyny of the time, exactly, which we still have today. You've heard this story before, but I'm constantly going to say it. My paternal grandmother, there were 5. I'm one of 5 grandchildren. One is a man. The rest are women. Which one do you think is the favorite, even though he screws up all the time? Like, there was she's dead now, so I can say whatever I want. So there's the internalized misogyny of many women. And, you can say it's getting better, but I've talked to some millennial women my age who have expressed views to me that were quite shocking and sounded quite antiquated. It's very, very, very deeply ingrained.
Yeah. And there is that moment at the end, and Kate's right, where Emma, is assuming both that, asking if it's a boy, and, if, Sabina wants a boy, and, she's like, no, we're perfectly fine with the girl. So I rather like that moment.
I just think that this movie could have easily passed the Bechdel test if they just would have had a couple of scenes of Sabina talking about her work with someone, also preferably other than Jung, maybe a couple times. Because the thing about graduate school is it can be very isolating and insular, but you also are constantly talking to people about your research. And I just would have liked to have seen some more scenes like that. We do see her, like, for example, you have that scene where he's coming to her apartment and she's sitting there obviously studying. She has the books everywhere, like, I know that feeling, right? And I was like, oh boy, this is exciting. And then he comes in and she like automatically drops all her stuff and it's focused on their drama. And, I was just like, dang, if they just would have gone a little longer with that scene of her studying, that's the kind of labor that she really went through for her career, right? And those 2 years of her with Jung, are important, but I understand why they were the focus of this movie, but I think that they could have just branched out a little bit with just the same scenes, but just a little bit more focus on her rather than them in the same room talking about their relationship or how they can't be together, but then, screwing the next day. Like, everyone's been there. But this idea of like, we can't be together, but then we do. And then, no, we can't be together. It's just like, it was a little soap opera in that way. But my favorite scenes were when she was talking to Jung about her work. And I just wish that would have been highlighted a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean,
exactly,
yeah, and I know, but that's.
Don't get me wrong. I really enjoyed the sex scenes. But, like I said, this was 2 years of this woman's life. And she had a whole career ahead of her after this. And, marriage and motherhood ahead of her. And even being killed by frickin' Nazis. I mean, like, this woman had a life, Yeah.
I mean, I just come back to, sort of, that's not it comes down to the story they chose to tell, and and the story that was being told through the play and such. I mean, for better or for worse, it is the dynamic between her, Freud, and Jung. So but there's much more story that could be told, and I yet hope that maybe there will be a film that explores her character in greater detail, and other aspects of her life in the future, which I think would be really good. Because one thing this movie did do is introduce me to her character, and to want to find out more about her, and so I do think
I'd like to see like Hidden Figures, but about Sabina. You know what I'm saying? Like showing them being in this male-dominated workforce, and trying to navigate her way through that. That would just be like my dream movie. Yeah.
So yeah. And now rather than dancing around it, I do want to talk about one of the more explosive scenes, which comes early in the film when Sabina, for lack of a better term, has her breakthrough. And I was joking around with you last night that I didn't know quite how to tackle discussing this scene, because there's really no way around just point blank saying something. So maybe you'll say them instead. But the fact that, again, as I was saying, she's having a hard time really expressing you're not going to have me talk about the stuff with only me on camera.
Amy. Sorry, lip gloss break.
There is no way that's
all right. We're good. We're good. Sorry, guys. Lip gloss. Okay. Yeah. I think a lot of it also stems. So she does find kind of the root cause of it, which is of course that her father would physically abuse her, and that would, for lack of a better term, turn her on. And she was obviously disturbed by that. And nowadays you can go on the internet and look for communities of people that are into BDSM and such. Kate, this is the right movie for that. But this at the time was not at all considered a kink, right? It was considered, basically sexual hedonism. So she was having such a clash with what I think was a bit of a conservative upbringing, and then also enjoying a form of, even though she hadn't had sexual experience, she, God, all right, here we go, everyone. She had obviously knows how to masturbate. She has masturbated, and she has been turned on. So she is in kind of a kind of crossroads of having all of these deviancy. It was seen as sexual deviancy. So she was having all of these kind of feelings and urges and no outlet for them, and she's all up in her head about how wrong she thinks they are, and that is what's caused her mental break, basically.
Yeah, I mean, just there's no way to really process and talk about that stuff in that society at that time. And so even as she's talking about, like, she's describing like what she was doing with these very abstract concepts of talking about, something slimy on her back, like a mollusk, and all this stuff. And Young just sort of, comes right and says, "Were you naked?" And she's like, "Yes." And says, "Were you masturbating?" And yes, everybody, I just said that on my stream.
I said it first.
Yeah, I know. You went there.
That was weird for me to say, though.
You went there for me. And the way she just sort of squeaks out, "Yes." And, it's this extreme uncomfortable, uncomfortability. Wow, I can't talk today with that kind of subject material. But it's such a breakthrough for her to, I know. It's such a breakthrough for her to be able to just even say that. But even as she's making that breakthrough, she's still like what she actually says is, you know, what you were just talking about, where she says the words that she's vile, filthy, and corrupt, and that there's no hope for her, and that she must never be let out of there.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you know, you just look at it from this modern lens and you're like, this poor girl.
Right? You could literally go on Craigslist and be like, I want someone to call me vile, filthy, and corrupt in bed while spanking me. Done. You have like 70 million dudes in your inbox, you know? Like these are things that nowadays could be used as dirty talk. But at the time were, you know, real self-indictments about herself. She really thought that there was something wrong with her. And I think that some of this movie is kind of her, like, repression is a great, I was just going to say Kelly has a great word, which is repression, which is that a lot of her breakthrough was about stopping the repression that she was really imposing on herself. Yes, of course, society gave her these ideas, but a lot of what society makes us do is self-censor. And she was doing self-repression. My goodness. Self-repression. And that is, once she basically is easier on herself and forgives herself and realizes that her childhood was one way and it affected her sexuality, but that she shouldn't then think that she screwed up forever and there's no hope for her, right? That she can make progress. She can feel more secure about herself. And she sure gives into those desires, doesn't she, John? When
I mean,
the character of Otto was fascinating to me as well.
Oh, is that just you redirecting as quickly as you can?
I'm just saying, Otto is like the little devil on Young's shoulder being like, you're gonna F her? You're gonna F her? You're gonna F her? Like, and we even have at the end that he died of starvation. Like, he was a little off his rocker, and yet he was...
Well, it's funny because I even said to you, it's like Young is going to him for advice. It's like literally going to the devil on your shoulder for, you know,
what do you think I should
permission.
Do? And they're like, have an affair. Have an affair. He's like Ashley Madison. Have an affair. Like,
yeah, and let me throw up a picture of him real quick. He is quite a character.
Quite a character.
And he is, of course, I'm losing track of names. Vincent Cassel is the actor's name, and if any of you have seen Black Swan, you should recognize him. And he's been in other Cronenberg films as well. He's a great actor. I never don't enjoy him on the screen, and in this he's particularly great just because he's incorrigible. He's a guy who has no restraint whatsoever. He actually even says, you know, one of his, you know, best lines is, you know, if there's one thing I've learned in my life, it's this: never repress anything. Yeah.
I'm sorry, when you're like, let me throw up a picture of him, I thought the same thing. I was like, are you okay, John? I think Otto was a really interesting character because it was basically, he was Young if Young would give into his demons, basically. Right? Young wanted to be a good psychologist, and part of that is keeping the patient psychiatrist, you know, relationship platonic and separate and professional. And it is against it's not even a question of morals. It's really against kind of the profession itself, because the profession is all about establishing trust. And when you have power dynamics like that, it's a Me Too moment waiting to happen, basically.
Yeah,
when you have that kind of, it's like a student-teacher trust being broken.
And the thing is, like, this was a whole new field that they were entering in. So if you consider how, you know, toxic masculinity is in general, you can imagine that it was, you know, in that this is something that wouldn't have occurred to somebody like Otto for there to be anything wrong with this whatsoever. It's like, our job is to make the patient feel good. So let's just go ahead and do that.
And he's like, oh, You have 2 kids? Yeah, by the same woman. Like he's a self-proclaimed polygamist. Like he's just off getting women pregnant all over the place and not taking any responsibility for them as a father. It's just classic. It's just classic deadbeat dad. Like I can't
Yeah.
with it. Yeah, basically.
And then I think Kate mentioned it earlier. Another line from his, which I love, when Jung says, "You think Freud is right?" And Otto says, "I think Freud's preoccupation with sex probably stems from the fact that he never gets any,"
Yeah.
which is hilarious.
Yeah, and that's something that I really find interesting when I'm reading Freud. I don't necessarily read it as this is canon. It's more like, what did this one man think about psychoanalysis and about himself? So the way that Freud writes about the relationship between a son and a father and a son and a mother, and the fact that, oh, all little boys fear being castrated by their father. It's like, okay, Freud, you as a little boy feared being castrated by your father, right? So he kind of, in Freud's writings, a lot of times he's bearing his soul as to his own kind of weird relationship with sexuality, and he projects that onto his patients and onto his colleagues and onto psychoanalysis as a profession and as a form of theory. So I think that that's really interesting, is that it's really, if you want to call him the founder of psychoanalysis, which most people do, it's basically founded by a man who struggled with his own sexuality, and particularly with ideas of growing up and perhaps seeing your mother in a way that is unhealthy. Right. And there are all of these kinds of things like that we think of, like Freudian slip. He's come into our colloquial speech and our zeitgeist, and I think that it's interesting to look at Freud, but to also be very cognizant that he had a lot of blind spots because of his own personal issues.
Yeah, and there's another interesting line. I mean, there's yeah, I keep saying that this film is filled with great writing. I think another line that comes from Jung is when he's talking to Sabina about Freud's fixation on on sort of answering everything with sex, and he says, you'd expect him to be right in a lot of cases, maybe even in most cases, but there must be more than one hinge into the universe. So I think that's a very valid point, and to it's important, so that because, as you say, he's seen as the founder of psychoanalysis, but you can't just look at everything from the lens of one man's experience.
Yeah, and particularly one man's obsession as well. Like Guilty has mentioned, and this is really important, that he was working with a lot of patients female patients who had been sexually abused by their father, or other adult males in their life. But it's so I think Freud really gleaned onto that, but at the same time, I think that Freud then kind of had like blinders. He was really so heavily focused on that if he were to come across a patient whose issues come from something different, he would then somehow try and tie it to, someone having attraction to their mom, or fear of castration, or like all of these different things, which I think is what Jung was really pushing back against. Jung was wanting to, like you said, with the line about there can't just be one hinge in the world. There are other sources of mental distress that are automatically kind of pushed aside when you have this one lens. And I think it makes it harder, because these men that were abusing his patients, right, had all of the power in the world. It was set up so that they could go, oh, this woman just went hysteric, I don't know why. And Freud probably didn't really have that much power to do anything about it. It was, okay, let's deal with the abuse that you have sustained and that will probably continue to experience, but it was never about stopping the abuse necessarily. So that's another kind of blind spot of this era, is that they didn't have the resources. Not saying that we do today, because we also fail at this, but this idea that, okay, let's focus on the trauma, and not really realizing that the trauma could still be being inflicted, essentially.
I just wanted to take another moment to just, while I have this picture up, it's like, everybody, that's Aragorn playing Sigmund Freud. It's like, I have great admiration for Viggo's ability to disappear into many different kinds of roles.
Absolutely.
Because actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think, and I don't remember if this was just a rumor or if it was in fact true, but I remember hearing that early on there were talks about, what's the actor's name from Django Unchained and Inglourious Bastards?
Is that the guy who played the dentist in
Django?
Gosh.
And I think that there was talk about him potentially playing Freud.
He also would have done a good job.
Yeah, Christoph Waltz. That's his name. And you could almost see that easier, but I rather like that Viggo played him because it's very unexpected, and I thought that he did a marvelous job. And in fact, I think he was the actor who really kind of broke through with some of the awards bodies and got nominations for this film, which is nice. But, as you and I talked about, I was rather furious that Keira didn't get, I think, barely any attention. And, not just, you would expect that from the Oscars, but I don't think she got much awards attention everywhere, which goes back to the fact that her performance was perceived as going too over the top or too far, which again I'm livid over, because I think it's one of her strongest performances.
Yeah, and you also, I think one major aspect of Keira's performance that stood out for me in this movie was the difference between how we see her in the very beginning, where she's going through the talk therapy, then to becoming a grad student and a professional, and then later a mother to be. You see her really getting her shit together. And I think that Keira, not just her gestures, but also her voice, the confidence, the way that she carried herself really changed. And I also noticed that when she was with Jung, when they were alone in kind of an intimate way, she kind of reverted back to being a little girl. But then when they were out and about together, or when she was not with him, which was not very often, unfortunately, in this movie, she carried herself much more like an adult. So I think Keira did a really good job of showing how that trauma you can deal with that with the trauma, but it never goes away.
I think, I definitely see what you're saying there, and I think you're right. But there is one key exception to that, which I think is one of their final scenes together. Not the very last one, but after they sort of give in to temptation again and have that scene that we were both watching from a very critical, clinical eye, and we're, very professional about watching. Yeah. But after that, once they're done, she's very confident and like not shy, and she's in control of that scene. So I really do see that moment as showing that she's evolved.
Transformed.
Yeah. She's fully transformed. And yeah, so I did like seeing that gradual change over the course of the film.
Yeah. And once again, the scene that came just before that, we were watching for the plot. Indeed.
Yes. We're professionals, damn it.
We are professionals, damn it.
But yeah, okay, let me find my train of thought again. Yeah, and when I was looking for pictures for the stream, I was like, don't want to get flagged.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. But moving back earlier, Dada was I'm sorry, because before I was going to talk about another one of their scenes, but let's try and move to a different territory. Let's talk about sort of the use of Wagner in the film, because yeah, the thirst is real. Keira, we respect you tremendously. This is one of your best roles.
She's a fan of the channel, so you know.
She is. But the use of Wagner throughout this film, I say that, you know, both because of its importance in the story, but also because Howard Shore's music takes its cues from Wagner. And there are some instances of just them using Wagner. I think one of my favorite moments is when Freud and Jung are arriving in America on the ship, and they actually use the Valhalla motif from the Rin cycle, and you know, it accompanies Freud saying, "Do you think they know we're coming, bringing them the plague?" And you know, another great line. And I just love the way that Wagner is interspersed throughout the score, and this is a very different kind of music from what Howard does for Lord of the Rings. And I think that a lot of his music for Cronenberg's films is sort of more low key and not, I was going to say not as operatic as Lord of the Rings, but the score is quite operatic. It's just in a different way. But I think he did a beautiful job. And actually, if anybody checks out the soundtrack, in addition to the actual score, there is an extended performance of Wagner's piece called the Siegfried Idyll, which is basically an extended, like, I think 15-minute piece that's played on piano, if I'm not mistaken. It's beautiful. So, okay, I've gotten my fill of talking about the music, and I'll stop there.
Go on as long as you want, John. I always appreciate some score talk. And this has been Score Corner with John Webster.
Yeah, damn it. You caught me. It was inevitable with this movie. There's just no way for me to talk about this film without blushing. Needless to say, nobody accompanied me while I was seeing this in the theater because I would have been way too embarrassed. Okay, you know, it's a good time for our midpoint break. So, you know, don't go anywhere, everybody. We're not done yet, but I'm going to do the mid-roll and move beyond my blushing. Next week, what are we doing, Amy? Because it's a bit of a detour, I feel, from our usual stuff.
What are we doing next week? And John, why are you so obsessed with this channel? That's right, you Googling Coco. We're talking about Mean Girls. I'm so excited for this. I got that right? We're doing Mean Girls next time. Okay, yeah. Thank God. And we are going to have the one, the only, our resident Canadian, Kate, is going to be on. We are going to have matching nails. We're both going to have dark pink nail polish. We're going to get all ready. You know, it won't be wearing pink on Wednesdays, but, you know, we stream on Saturdays. What can you do? So we're going to have a great time talking about one of my favorite movies. I saw it in theaters with my mom right as I was about to go into high school. It changed my life, and Tina Fey is brilliant. She's an amazing comedian, and we are going to have such a good time. John, haven't seen it yet?
I have never seen it, which is going to be a first for this channel, covering a movie that I will have just seen for the first time. And speaking of which, actually, it is sitting out in the living room because I just got the Blu-ray in the mail. Because you all know, physical media. I had to buy it. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing it.
You and everyone else, Kelly. You and everyone else. Kate, we should have a watch party. That would be really fun.
We absolutely will.
That one is okay to have a watch party with. You know, I mean, yeah.
We're supposed to be moving.
We had a solo watch party, but that was one time. Sorry, you'll get all these references later, John. Anyway, we're going to talk about Mean Girls. What are we doing after that, next week after that, John?
We are covering the 2000 film X-Men with a couple of people. We're having Kelly on. And who else are we having on, Amy?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe my best friend in the whole wide world since I was 10, Jenna. I'm so excited. I said Jenna and like I was angry at her. Jenna, my best friend. I'm so excited. She is some of the reason that I was able to survive growing up in Oklahoma. And you go, Glen Coco. We're going to have a great time with Jenna and Kelly talking about it. And yeah, we're all four of us are X-Men fans. We're going to try and keep it to the movie, but we'll probably also talk a little bit about X-Men lore and some other things and our favorite characters.
Yeah,
and such.
I mean, it's inevitable, especially since I did just spend some of my Christmas money on that X-Men the Animated Series art book. So
we're going to have to talk about X-Men like as a franchise overall, or else, we can't keep to the movie, because X-Men, it was the start of the franchise on the big screen, but that's, X-Men has been in comic form and animated form before then. So, it's really important to talk about that as well.
Real quick, I'm not sure if this means if you have to go, if you think we're wrapping up. We're not actually done with the stream yet. This is just our mid-roll. So if anybody thinks that we're over, we haven't finished yet. So by all means, if you can stick around, please do. But yeah, I mean, X-Men for me, like that film coming out was like the culmination of years of being, a fan of the animated series and the franchise as a whole. So it's kind of impossible for me, at least, to talk about that film without talking about everything that preceded it. So we're going to have a lot of material to go on that stream.
So that'll be Saturday after next. And then the Saturday of January, we will be talking about Pan's Labyrinth.
Yes, and we're going to have two very special guests. We're going to have Cecilia from Geeksteria, and we're also going to have this guy Steven Stark. You might have heard of him. He's from this channel. What's it called? Here be
Flagons.
Yeah, I
be tricycles.
Yeah, maybe that's it. I don't know. But yeah, so that's going to be a blast. That's been one of my favorite movies for years. I remember when I saw that in theaters, and I was. At that point, it had been a few years since Lord of the Rings came out, and I remember thinking, this is like the most satisfying theatrical experience I've had since Fellowship of the Ring. So I have a lot of love for that film, and I can't wait to talk about it. It's going to be fun. Yeah, actually, Kate, I think you nailed it. Yeah,
it is Here Be Griffins. Wait, oh man, I don't know. It's some channel you guys may have heard. Yeah, so that's what we have coming up. So that'll do us for January.
Yeah, and I do want to take this time to say that if you're enjoying this talk and, you want more of this, you can find the Knights of Keira on Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr. Just follow these links and also subscribe to this channel.
There's a little icon down there. And we do a Keira stream about every other month at this point. So you will get plenty of Keira content.
And we did put out a poll recently about, what people wanted to see next from the Knights of Keira. And so we're going to be doing a drum roll? Yeah. Pirates of the Caribbean. Surprise, surprise. Who knew that if I put out a poll, that it would
pirates on it, that it would be
the most popular.
How strange.
So yeah, yeah, follow us if you want to be constantly thirsty. Yeah, guilty as charged. But yeah, we're gonna have a blast covering Pirates of the Caribbean, and we already have a couple guests in mind, so we'll let you know. And personally speaking, I will just say I just ordered my first ever actual Keira shirt, which I'll be wearing for that stream. It'll be an Elizabeth Bennet shirt, to be precise. So I'll actually be able to rep my love of Keira for that stream. So I know that's very important to all of you.
Extremely. Really sets the mood.
Yeah. Okay, Amy. Well, you have your own channel with lots of stuff going on. So why don't you tell the folks what you have going on?
Absolutely. So yes, this is my channel, and it is the companion to my blog. As you'll notice, it has Chinese Lit in the title. I'm a PhD student of Chinese literature, so I look at Western fantasy through an Eastern lens. I have some A Song of Ice and Fire and His Dark Materials content out, and I'm going to start doing Avatar: The Last Airbender, The Witcher, and John, have you heard of the Poppy War? It's an amazing
book.
I
don't think I have.
By R.F. Kuang, and I love it. And I have some people in the chat in my book club. I'm reading it to them, and I'm going to start all sorts of content. So I'm going to continue my His Dark Materials and A Song of Ice and Fire content as well. So what I have coming up, I have a collaborative essay I'm working on with Julie, not Jolie, our dear friend in the Netherlands, Julie Flint, and she and I work together on a dark star theory that you can find on my channel. We are going to write about John and his questionable leadership choices in the 5th book as the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. We're gonna have a really good time doing that. And okay, the 11th of so in 2 days, I'm going to be on Jolie. Other one, Jolie's channel. So if one of the mods could drop the All Hail the Night's Queen YouTube channel, I would love you forever. We, at 5 p.m. Eastern on the 11th, we are going to stream about the Others and the North and what's going on beyond the wall. So she's going to do her first ever live stream. She's going to start this series called The Night's Queen's Court, where she's going to have people in the fandom on to talk about all things A Song of Ice and Fire. So that's going to be her first episode. And I know the month after that, she's going to talk about the Ironborn, and I think she's going to have Crowfood's daughter from the Disputed Lands on. So it's going to be lots of fun. So please check out All Hail the Night's Queen, her channel. I will be on there. And December 22nd is going to be the 2nd episode of Buddy Banter. Hey, guess who was the first buddy I bantered with? Over here, John. So you can check out my first episode. It's basically a new series I started. About every month, I'm going to have a friend on the channel to talk about whatever they want to talk about. Thank you, Kate. And so John and I talked about gender stereotypes and how it affects the media that we like or that we're pushed to like or not like. And what I'm going to talk about on the 22nd at 9 p.m. Eastern. Yes. I'm going to talk with Micah, Sir Micah of Clark, and we are going to talk about DC shows, animated or live action, and movies. We're going to talk a little bit about how, you know, DC comics translate to the TV, and we're going to have a lot of fun talking about that. So whether you're a DC fan or not, it would be fun. Obviously I am. I've got my Kid Flash shirt going, but we're gonna have a really good time. So that's what I've got coming up in January. I'm sure I'm working on an essay right now that's looking at comparing Danny Flint and Alara / Sorella from A Song of Ice and Fire to Hua Mulan. You guys might know her from a Disney movie called Mulan. So that will probably come out soon. And I'm also have an essay on yin and yang theory as well. And yin and yang. I can't say it the American way. Yin and yang. To talk about that as well in A Song of Ice and Fire. And some His Dark Material stuff. I have an essay coming up about Mary Malone, who's my favorite character. So lots of stuff. Kelly, you're the only ginger I like, okay? You're special. And yes, right. We're going to talk a lot about the animated Justice League because that show was a huge part of my childhood. So we're going to have a really good time, me and Micah. Once again, that's January 22nd at 9 p.m. Eastern. We were going to do it on the 20th, but there might be something going on that day. Nah, there's nothing going on that day. Never mind. I don't think there is. There's nothing. Anyway, I'm sorry about the long plug, but please check me out. Here, my links are in the description, but here is my channel. I read all my essays to you. You don't, I mean, so many essays that make you read and read. You don't have to. You can listen to me read it and then have someone on or multiple someones to talk about it. But if you prefer reading it, because you're like me and you like to read, also my blog. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, I do want to say that I'm not familiar with any Pirates movies that weren't the Elizabeth Swann show.
Yeah, so. It stopped after the third. After the third, there was. Yeah. Oh, and Kelly's also going to be on for the Ironborn episode on All Hail the Night's Queen's channel.
Yeah, I am looking forward to our Pirate stream because we're going to get to actually explain why the main character of Pirates of the Caribbean is Elizabeth Swann. So, yeah.
Yep. A. Mayburn said it, like, Jack Sparrow is a cool character, but Elizabeth was the heart of that show.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dive back in and go back to me blushing. Because that's just what I'm going to do. What's interesting is that we were talking earlier about how you know, about how Sabina goes from not being able to really accept, you know, what she's feeling and sort of what she's gone through in her life, and has a hard time even expressing that. But she goes from that to engaging in this relationship with Jung, to the point where she actually uses her confessions to basically seduce him, which is a great transformation, where she actually, you know, it comes to the point where, and it's, you know, sort of hilarious, but also typical, that Jung keeps saying, "Don't you think we should stop?" every time after they have sex. It's like,
yeah, after he's gotten his nut, then he's like, "Wait, this is wrong."
And then she says, "What's between us will be different. I want you to be ferocious." And she says, "I want you to punish me." So she's using
hot.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's my commentary, everyone. Hot.
So she's using that, you know, the knowledge that, you know, he knows about her, and those confessions to basically seduce him. And, you know, and it's like, you know, girl. But yeah, it's, and sorry, once again, I'm losing my train of thought. I'm just trying to think about what
Kate said I didn't have to turn off my camera, so you guys are seeing the behind the scenes stuff over here. There we go. Nice.
Okay.
Yeah, she really comes into her own as far as kind of embracing her sexuality. And boy, does Jung have a good time. But like you were saying afterwards, he's like, "This is wrong. We shouldn't do this." But sure seems to be having a good time during. So, you know.
Yeah, and Cronenberg actually says that, you know, as far as the well, there's no way around it, like the spanking scenes, we're just going to say it. There's an element of that where he's actually, Jung isn't so much into that. He's not sort of masochistic in that way, but he knows that it's pleasurable for her. So it's sort of going off of what Otto says, which is, you know, he's telling him to give her what she wants, basically. And so, but yeah, sorry, folks, there's no way for me to not talk about this without getting really.
I mean, you know,
going full blush.
You kind of, unless it's something that you absolutely don't want to do or it is uncomfortable for you, you kind of you service your partner in the way that they want. And so Jung is kind of, she said, "Here's my kink," and he's, you know, performing that kink for her. So I think that it is a sign that he you know, is wanting to take care of her needs, if you will, in the way that she wants them to be taken care of. But like I said earlier, there is that power dynamic. Even when she is no longer his student, he is a mentor to her, and you know, she has to look at her dissertation and such. So it is still, I think, a violation of trust.
Yeah.
But I mean, he keeps doing it, so might as well do it the way she wants.
And then there's,
but seriously, this whole movie's a Me Too moment.
Yeah, it really is.
There's no getting around that.
And then, you know, it comes to the point where it's interesting, because we were talking about, obviously, Jung's wife earlier, and you know, what we get first is where it's a scene where I just sort of roll my eyes at Jung, which is very easy to do in this movie, where you know, she's like, you know, she's talking about being pregnant again, and she's like, "I imagine you wish, you know, you were like Otto Gross, you know, polygamist." And he's like, you know,
"Oh no,
if I were, it would be something very different from what we have, which is sacred." And it's like,
I wanted to punch him in the face with that line.
It's like,
such a hypocrite.
It's like, no, well, yeah, aside from the fact that, yeah, he's currently doing it, but he's also saying, "No, that's not what I want, unless you're okay with it."
Yeah.
And then she's like, but I like the fact that what she says then is like, she's like, I wouldn't want to know about it. But then, like, as soon as she does, you know about it, which she's gonna know about,
yeah,
because she already knows that that's what's going on. She's immediately like writing letters and spreading it around, and
yeah. And I never believe I've actually had a couple of partners tell me, like, if you cheated on me, I wouldn't want to know about it. I'm like, please, you would want to know. Don't lie to me. You know, it's like, oh, I don't know. It's like putting yourself, it's like, oh, I wouldn't be so petty, right? But then you would be, and rightfully so. I mean, she should expect monogamy. This is not at all putting down his wife. It's just that I think that she saw herself in a bit of a light, at least the way she's represented in this movie. Her character, I think, put her own self, she was a little self-aggrandizing, put herself up on a pedestal, thinking that she would be mature about reacting to this, which was not the case.
Yeah. And then of course, what follows that is...
Ooh, Guilty has a good point. He's the classic, I'm a nice guy, right? Ugh, thank you, Guilty. That really helped me with rolling my eyes more. God, he's insufferable at times in this movie.
And then just what we were talking about, after, the letters are going around, and, and it becomes an actual rumor, Freud confronts him about this, and then he once again goes to Sabina, and he's like, okay, I think we need to stop this now. And it's like, and this comes once again after, they've been in bed together. It's like, you're just insufferable, dude.
Yeah.
Maybe if you actually meant that, you might have said that before you got into bed one more time.
And I think that I get the sense from him that it's about his reputation as a psychiatrist, rather than how it would harm her taking advantage of the power dynamics. Do you get what I'm saying? In other words, yeah. He's saying, oh, ethics, but it's not, this is morally wrong. It's people are going to see me as a skeezy dude who's just, using this talking method to try and get with women. And he's worried about his image rather than how this is negatively affecting her. First of all, she's starting to kind of develop feelings for him, for a guy that she can't have. And he's her doctor, right? He's not supposed to breach that kind of trust. So it looks like he's doing the right thing by at first resisting. But the way that he gives in the end shows that it wasn't really about morals. It was about his image. And he gave into his desires because if he had a real moral conviction, that would have overcome his, horniness, frankly.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's all about his reputation, because it's like either actually, have an actual moral objection to it and go with that, or throw everything to the wind if you obviously, regardless of how wrong it might be, from a professional standpoint and all that, if you actually care about this person, then, go into that and say, okay, I'm going to throw everything away and pursue that relationship. Instead, he's so concerned about his standing that he's trying to consistently have it both ways. And
you see that with her wanting him to write a letter to Freud to clear things up. Because yeah. Freud thinks that she's just obsessed with him. Why are you so obsessed with me? Anyway, sorry, more. Oh, John, I can't wait for you to see Mean Girls. Anyway, there's this kind of, she wants to become Freud's patient. So she asks Jung to write to Freud and clear things up and say, it wasn't just that she was obsessed with me. We were in I hate to use the term mutual because, like I said, the power dynamics, but at the time it would have been seen as a consensual relationships, even though it wasn't fully, so that Freud would take her as a patient, and Jung didn't want to do that. And what's that would have been telling the truth. So he doesn't care about the truth. He cares about what other white dudes in psychoanalysis think about him.
Yeah, and especially Freud, because there's this dynamic where, and she even says that in this scene where she's like, you don't feel the same way about him, do you, as he feels about you? Because she says he loves you as his son. And while Jung just kind of views Freud with, sort of distaste, and he doesn't, really respect him. And And so this whole thing is like more about when she's like, I, want you to write a letter, and I want him to take me on as, his patient. He's like, does it have to be him? And like, that's what he cares about in that scene.
Yeah.
And it's just so insufferable.
It's really like, I wanted to throw my shoes at the TV. It was just so annoying. Oh man, I really had a hard time just not hating him completely as a character. Like, I tried to find little things here and there. Like, I did like how he pushed back against Freud on a couple of things that I myself disagreed with Freud about. Floyd. But otherwise, Jung just felt like just another asshole, honestly, in this at least this portrayal of him. And you look at it, even in the end credits, it was like, Freud died and Sabina was killed by Nazis, and freaking Jung like lived out his days and died peacefully in bed. It's like, dang it, Jung, you didn't deserve that.
As I even said to you when we were chatting about it, was like, of course he gets to die, of old age and all that stuff. It's like, God damn it.
It's not fair. I think it was that they said Freud died of a heart attack. Is that correct? I forgot. But it was right before World War II began in earnest, which actually, I hate to say, but now that, especially since Guilty informed me that, Freud was Jewish, like, he actually kind of dodged a bullet by dying before World War II. But yeah.
I actually think at the end it said that he was driven out by the Nazis.
Driven out. Okay. So he did experience some of the persecution then, definitely.
But he wasn't
cancer. That's what it was. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah,
it was in 1939. He died of cancer. So yeah. So he was obviously not only was he an intellectual, but he was a Jewish intellectual. So that would have been
in that way, he still, as you say, dodged a bullet by actually escaping with his life at the time, because
not many people were so lucky. Yeah. And I do think that was a little bit, and this is nothing against him, especially because we're talking about how he was persecuted against, but his privilege as well, that he was able to just pick up and leave. A lot of poor people were really stuck when the Nazis invaded. So, and he had connections, obviously, because of his work in psychoanalysis. So,
but diving more into this conflict between Freud and Jung, there is that scene where Jung is going on about all these, ideas that Freud finds completely outlandish. And I love Viggo's performance in that scene, because he's like, there's a moment where Jung says, that's called I don't remember what he said, but it's like this long word. Yeah. And Freud is like, oh, what?
Yeah.
and then later he's like,
I remember, because there was the pipes or something, or the heater was making a noise, and he's like, I knew it would happen. I felt something.
Yeah, it's the wood, the wood's cracking, which is also a sort of a beautiful, maybe on the nose, idea that the wood is cracking, and so is their relationship. It's fracturing at that point. And so, and I just love where he's like, all this mysticism and telepathy and all this stuff, it won't do.
Yeah.
I love it. Very, proper Freudian.
But I get that, because Freud had been around longer, and he had seen the pushback against psychoanalysis and how it was still not yet fully an accepted practice. And he didn't want any kind of, because this would have been coming off of about 40 or so years ago, 40, 50 years ago, mysticism had, and these ideas, there were these traveling people who could allegedly could talk to ghosts and levitate and read minds. And so the early 1900s was a time when a lot of intellectuals were trying to focus on what they considered to be rationality and not consider any spiritual things, because the 1800s had been so full of, there's a word for it, I cannot remember, but it was a certain type of spiritualism at that time that was particularly performative. And they didn't want that. They didn't, and it was there were a lot of charlatans that were, like, there were these twins that in the 1800s, I'm sorry, this is a little off topic, but I found it fascinating. They would go around and they had this whole stage show, and they allegedly they would ask, like, the ghosts to knock once or twice, and they were popping their toes, and that's how it sounded like ghosts were knocking. So you had a lot of charlatanism at the time. There occultism was some of it, Jenna. But there's another word. It was on last podcast on the left. I know Jenna listens too, so she probably knows what I'm talking about. But it was really big at the time, and so I think the early 1900s, in Freud's camp especially, were wanting to present psychoanalysis as a form of science of the mind rather than any type of spiritual kind of healing.
Yeah.
Fox sisters. Sorry, I thought they were twins, but maybe they weren't. The Fox sisters were the ones I was talking about.
The fact that, as Freud keeps, hitting upon throughout the entire film, is that they have so many enemies, and especially because the majority of their circle were Jewish, and as he says, if they detect any weakness, they'll pounce, and there was just no room for anything like that. And Freud, says he considers it professional suicide.
I think it was called spiritualism. I just did a quick Google search, and the Fox sisters in spiritualism, 1854 to 1873. So yeah, that seemed to be what it was. Spiritualism is what it was talked about. M. Abrams, I really suggest that you do just a really quick search on the Fox sisters, because they were essentially traveling performers who claimed to speak to the spirits, be able to have premonitions, read people's minds, levitate, these kinds of things. There were all sorts of different types of spiritualism and mysticism performers at the time. So Freud was really going into the early 1900s. He was really seeing the turn of the 20th century as being a time of going away from the spiritual aspects of the mind, whereas Jung was a little bit more in this portrayal, at least a little bit more open-minded. Oh, interesting. Jung, Kate says she might have remembered that Jung was into seances, so that's interesting. But that the Ouija board was invented in the 1800s, so it was very much the time for all of this kind of exploration into the spiritual realm.
Yeah, and just again, I admittedly don't know much about Jung, beyond what's portrayed in this film. But what I found interesting was that Cronenberg said in the commentary track that as his life went on, he sort of almost became like the leader of a church almost with regard to his ideas and his patients and followers and stuff. So I actually find that rather interesting, which I didn't. And I didn't know about him. You hear about these names like Freud and Jung, and of them, but you don't know much about them. So it's actually one of those things where I want to do some more reading up on this stuff, so that I know a bit more than just a fictionalized account from this movie, because it would be interesting.
This also actually ties into Freud's interest in dream analysis, because at that point there was this idea that people could dream the future, or people could talk to the dead in their dreams. So I think that it was also Freud's way of trying to science up, basically, the analysis of dreams as well.
Yeah, because it was, what he was talking about was on very unstable footing itself. So he wanted to root it in as much, sort of firm science as he possibly could. And what Jung was talking about was just way too far off the track. So,
yeah, I think it really, at least in this movie, showed kind of the battle in between Jung's kind of openness and the wanting to explore. He was younger, kind of wanting to. He basically didn't want to close off the reasons to all be scientific. He wanted to also open up perhaps spiritual reasons for phenomena. And Freud wanted to shut that down, because he had seen how hard it was to even get the word psychoanalysis out there, much less make it a respected field.
And there's another scene, which is actually the only scene that is shared in the film between Keira Knightley and Viggo Mortensen, which is kind of hard to believe. just when you take a step back and look at it, because it feels like, maybe it's because they also have that letter writing scene earlier in the film. But what's interesting about the scene that they do share is when, Freud is talking about how he found it, the paper very interesting, but he's also in the same breath kind of talking down to her, because he's like, I don't quite see the things the way that you do, but I'm happy that you illustrated it in such a stimulating way. It's like,
a little
that's so
patronizing.
freaking passive aggressive. And
Yeah.
But
for Freud, at least in this portrayal, he's very narrow-minded, and that he kind of wants his patients and his students to see it his way and to expand on his ideas. But a real scholar and a real man of science, woman of science, non-binary individual of science, would want to be challenged because it opens the possibilities for further discovery. But this portrayal of Freud showed him as he's getting later in his years and more set in his ways.
Yeah, I think the film very much illustrates the two characters as both very stubborn, and you can also kind of see both of their perspectives as well, probably in no small doubt, because they're both very interesting to watch, but they're also kind of, they don't have great qualities. I think one of the more interesting things was that Cronenberg went out of his way to not make Jung a likable character. I know there's one part in the film where it's actually a difference from the stage play, where Christopher Hampton, who wrote both the play and the screenplay for the film, had, when he and Sabina are talking about Wagner, and she says, "You like Wagner?" I think in the stage play he says, he's a great admirer of the music, kind of leaving out the idea about Wagner, the man who is was anti-Semitic and all of that. But in the film, the point is made for him to say that he admires the music and the man, to show that to really highlight these not very unlikable qualities about Jung, that he may have known that Wagner was not a very good person, but still admired him. So I think it's interesting that they go out of their way to sort of paint these very truthful portrayals of these characters, and the fact that, as interesting as they are to watch, like I said before, they're you see numerous flaws in their character.
Yeah, and I also think it's interesting to kind of that they all see these men are in some ways taken down from their pedestal. Mm-hmm. Like we see them talk about, right? You have Freud being like, he has like 6 kids, right? And he's like, oh my God, so they're so expensive and everything. And then Jung being like, good thing I married rich, and it's kind of like showing their struggles or lack thereof. You know what I'm saying? And because Jung was from, was it Sweden or Switzerland? God, I'm the worst about Western Europe. Was he Swiss or Swedish? Oh, I'm the worst. I'm sorry. Ask me about China.
It says he was Swiss.
Swiss, right? Yeah. So he could, when things get bad, right, especially with World War II, he could just go back, to Switzerland. Like he had a very comfortable life compared to Freud and Sabina and many other people. And so I really find it, I was just about to say that, Kate. I really think that a lot of their, at least in this movie, a lot of their kind of tension comes from Freud's jealousy of Jung's comfortable life.
Yeah, and the fact that Jung didn't have to ever worry about like monetizing psychoanalysis like Freud did. He could just do whatever he wanted, delve into the areas of the field and do these studies without a care in the world about the money. And Freud mm-hmm. was having to be concerned with that greatly. But yeah, I do love that moment where Freud's like, and then of course there's the added financial burden, and Jung's like, oh no, fortunately that's not a problem. My wife
He's very rich.
Very rich. And Freud's like, ah, that is fortunate.
Yeah, very fortunate.
So even the seeds are planted at that point where, they're having like this warm, friendly rapport, but those seeds are planted of what's going to splinter the friendship. But even so, I do rather like that scene early on because, it is kind of nice to see these two guys who, share a very, particular interest, in their field. And the fact that I like, they talk about how the conversation goes on for like 13 hours. And I do like that moment where, Freud says, "Don't apologize, my dear friend. It was our first meeting. We had a lot to talk about."
Had a lot to talk. Yeah, it really, and like, hope no one I think in the chat will get this, and hopefully maybe someone randomly watching later will. It reminds me a lot of what I read about modern Chinese authors who had like professional or even friendships with other modern Chinese authors. So one thing I find particular is Lu Xun had some professional relationships with other writers of the time, such as Mao Dun. I know this means nothing, but what I'm trying to say is that what is most fascinating is the archives that we have of their letters to each other. That is really interesting. So that kind of reminded me of Sabina, Freud, and Jung's kind of correspondence back and forth. You can learn a lot about kind of their relationship through that, and it is kind of a piece of history, but it also often kind of leaves out a lot of the more personal things that I think this movie was trying to fill in.
And as was mentioned earlier, I think in the chat, a lot of the dialogue from this film actually does come from their correspondence in letters and stuff, which is great. And yeah, I do love that scene, Kate. It's
yeah, and Gio has a really, really great point here, which is it really does show the difference of kind of the closeness of the families. And certainly Jung, they seem more proper even during intimate moments, whereas Freud seems to have a little bit more of a middle class, or maybe a little bit more upper middle class kind of family that it's everyone's kind of closer together rather than kind of the rich space that Emma and Jung inhabit.
Yeah, and another really interesting thing that I want to touch on with that scene, when they're later in the evening or in the morning, probably when they're talking about having had such a long conversation, also like all the stuff with talking about dreams in that scene. What's remarkable is that was kind of unheard of in those days, of such an intimate conversation between two men. And it's still a rarity. It's, the concept of talking to your therapist is more, it's accepted nowadays. But in terms of like, just two men kind of, going back and forth and talking about intimate things like their dreams and sexuality.
Yeah, he literally is like, maybe the log represents your penis. It's like, oh my God.
It's like, just think about that conversation taking place. And this was like a new thing. It's not like, it was under the guise of, oh, I'm just talking to my, a therapist or something like that. That was not a comfortable concept back then. So this was these two guys just talking about that. It's insane when you think about that within the confines of the time. And I think that seeing a scene like that is still, even in today's standards, it's out there. It's not common, and but
it was even today. It was quite a bit shocking how open that conversation was. And we would hope that today we were a little bit more open to these kinds of conversations. But I found that whole scene just really interesting, because you did have, like, Freud kind of hit all the classics. He's like, dream analysis, maybe it's phallic symbolism, like, getting Jung to really open up. It really kind of, I think it was a great way to further introduce Freud's character, and to show his kind of interest in his field. And he gave, so much of his time to talking to Jung this one time. It really also shows his, quite frankly, his obsession with psychoanalysis itself.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, sorry. Sometimes we do get embroiled in a conversation. I forget to throw up some picks, M. Abrams, but yeah, we do our best. And I know earlier you put out a request for like some clips and stuff, but unfortunately, we just can't do that from a copyright standpoint. I would love to put up clips from the movie. It would make these things a lot easier to be able to show some scenes.
Yeah, I know some people do like a watching commentary, and it's literally someone like there like watching off screen, because otherwise you get hella sued, or they take down your video, which we don't want happening. So, but yeah, we definitely, John works really hard reformatting the pictures and everything. So mad props to him, because I just sit here and talk. So
yeah. And yeah, I do want to, speaking of pictures, I have some pictures right here of the conversation between Sabina and Freud, which I do want to talk about a bit, because it's a great scene. And I just like the fact that, he points out, he thinks, his only real complaint, he says, about her paper is that, that she introduces, talks about God and religion, and in, I think, the opening and stuff. And, and once again, it's this idea of this battle he has with Freud, where not Freud, Jung, where he's, talking about, he doesn't care, what a person, believes, in their own private life, but he thinks it should be kept out of their research and work. And I like the fact that she says, is that what's at the nature of your dispute with Dr. Jung? He says, I have no dispute with Dr. Jung.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, sure.
And I think that's a fascinating thing to think about too, because if you just want to look at schizophrenia itself, one thing that I find fascinating about schizophrenia is that it presents differently based on what culture you're raised in. So if you were raised in a culture and were exposed to a lot of Christianity, a lot of schizophrenic patients then will picture demons or, evil spirits in the form of, Christianity. So it is actually important to consider the religious upbringing of the patient, because their psychotic breaks, if they are having hearing voices or having visions, it is often tied to what they have been exposed to. So, so schizophrenic patients in Asia often will see hungry ghosts, or will see, if they believe they're talking to gods in India and they were raised Hindu, they will believe that Krishna is talking to them. So I think it's actually is important for psychiatrists to understand the religious background and cultural background of their patients. But like we were talking about earlier, Freud was really worried about the legitimacy of psychoanalysis, and he was constantly guarding against what he believed to be kind of a bastardization of it, particularly when it comes to spirituality. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which I find fascinating, which is spiritualism in the 1800s was hot. It was the thing around town, right? And so he was so ready to get beyond that, go into the 1900s and have what he believed to be rational scientific thought. That being said, now when we look back, a lot of his stuff looks really silly, like his obsession with I'm just going to take penis envy, for example. He basically thought that women were envious of the male member itself, not seeing that women are actually envious of the power position that men hold, right? And he saw it so strictly in terms of sex that he couldn't look beyond that and look on more abstract ideas such as power dynamics and success and satisfaction, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of where he was forward looking for his time, but also boxing himself in at the same time, which is not to say that Jung was the better person. His whole thing was like, I knew that was going to happen. I felt it in my stomach. I was like, oh God, Jung, kill me now. It's like, it was a very narcissistic of Jung to think that, right? That he thinking that you possess some kind of psychic abilities, in my opinion, is inherently narcissistic. It thinks that you've been chosen by God or by gods or by nature to have some kind of ability. So I thought that Jung saying that was like, dude, you're not special. Can you stop?
Well, yeah, and you have the exact same reaction that Freud had, which is like, what on earth are you talking about? So, but yeah, and just we're winding it down. That is if we stick.
We're staying to 2 hours. I will leave this stream, and it will be you alone talking about Keira being spanked, and that's what will happen.
No, do not do that. I can do that when it's just
those
the two
in the chat.
Us,
once a month, no. I have a friends game night, and there's 6 of us, and it's really hard to find a time for all 6 of us to be able to get together. So once a month, I will keep him to 2 hours, and if we have guests, they can keep going. But I'm out. I'm pulling the plug this time, John.
So the film kind of starts to wrap up where this complete disintegration of the relationship between Freud and Jung, which is fascinating the way it's done, because it's done through letter writing, which as I said before is it's very important to this film, which is and the way that the credits are set up to emulate that.
Yeah.
And it's this very sarcastic back and forth between the characters, where Jung is criticizing Freud about the way he treats his friends like patients and all that, and then he says, I say this as a friend, and it's like, you dick.
It would be like if you were to have a kind of be looking at the emails of scholars right now, but in 30 years or something, right? It's their correspondence, but it also, like many of you in the chat might relate to, often our emails to colleagues can be a little passive aggressive if we're having a little bit of a conflict. So, I like to look at letters, especially because I study about 1880 to 1930-ish China, and a lot comes from letters between writers. And you really learn about kind of some of the things that were going on between them, and how they presented themselves in the letters is also interesting, right? Because you originally had Jung presenting himself and Sabina and their relationship to Freud as something that it wasn't, right? He was able to control the narrative through letters, and that starts to change when Sabina has him write the letter that's true about their relationship, and then Freud and Jung start to kind of have little spats here and there, and that's all done through letters.
Yeah, and we need to focus on the latter part of the film, but I'll just jump back, because what's very important is the fact that, as Freud says to Sabina, what really kind of turned me away from him was all the business with you, the lies, the deceit. He was really disappointed in Jung by that, because before that he writes back to Sabina when she first contacts him, and he's like, Dr. Jung is a trusted friend and colleague, and I know him. I know it to be impossible for him to engage in, such shabby behavior, and so I think he's really disappointed when he finds out that it was in fact true. And as you said in our chat, it's like, oh my God, the woman was telling the truth. Oh my God,
that never happens. Yeah, no, it's back then, and in some ways today too. Men will control the narrative, knowing that others are more likely to believe them over the woman and how they present the narrative. And Jung also held a position of being a scholar, and she was just a student, so there's so much gender power dynamics going on there.
And I do like some great lines throughout the film, just when Freud says, for a long time now, I don't know it exactly, I'd have to look it up, but our relationship has been hanging by a thread, and a thread made up of only the past disappointments. We lose nothing by cutting it, which is just great. Yeah, exactly.
I love this, Kate. What? But maybe, John, if we wanted to move forward, we could talk about this discussion, because I found that really fascinating.
Which I do want to point out that this this would not have happened in real life. They actually didn't meet again, I believe. But a lot of the
Poetic
dialogue and
license.
stuff, it's poetic license, but also a lot of what's said in the scenes was said through letters and stuff. So it's just, again, some poetic license, but I think the core of it still, holds true, because this is a visual way of representing, what was actually communicated in real life.
Yeah, and I think my favorite part of this scene is when she asks him about, I hear you have this new mistress, and what was it? Something Wolf. I forgot her first name.
Tony.
Tony, Toni, Tony Wolf. And she asks, oh, is she like me? And he goes, oh, no, nothing like you. Sorry, I can't speak normally for Jung in this movie because he's such an ass. And she goes, really? She's a psychoanalysis student? Yes. Oh, is she Jewish? Half Jewish. It's like, dude, you're dating Sabina again. Come on.
But like, she's
it was
not
so obvious.
But she's not like me.
Like you. Yeah. So that's this was a very kind of, I like this scene because it's very much a Sabina finally kind of sticking up for herself and seeing Jung for kind of the pathetic guy that he is, like he kind of mooches off his wife. He's kind of a jerk, and he, his work was important, but he still will always kind of live in the shadow of Freud. So I think she really saw that.
And yet she still cares about him deeply. There's, that exchange where, which is an insufferable line from him, where he says, it should be mine, talking about the baby. But she says, yes, it should be. I think she still loves him very much, all in spite of everything. And so but it is her.
I kind of took this as her, like in Colette when she said, I've outgrown, oh God, it's totally escaping me.
See, I didn't see it that way.
You didn't see it? I like when we read the same scene differently. That's fascinating.
I think that there's no part of her that is, like tempted into like going back with him or anything, but I do think that there's still, a connection there, that, and she cares deeply for him. And as she's leaving, I think you can see that with her in the carriage, the tears in her eyes. And so I don't see it the same as Colette. I think it's very different.
Yeah, I can see that, but I do kind of see it as her I'm moving on scene. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's kind of absolutely what I mean when she said I've outgrown basically this thing from this whole situation from Colette. I kind of saw her saying, oh, you have this new mistress, and she's like, she kind of sees it as that was me then, and this is me now, and I've grown up, I have matured. That's kind of how I read it. So I don't think we're on exact opposite ends of how we read it. I just think I probably read more, you definitely read more attachment into it than I did.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think the resolve to move on and having come to a new sort of emotional place rules out the fact that she still felt great affection and attachment towards him. I think she probably always will.
I mean, you always remember your first. So they definitely had, a lot of, I'll just pop some more of these up there, a lot of intimate moments between them, and I think that she will always kind of remember him in that way.
I'm sorry, I just have to comment that that was the picture that I threw up on Instagram a few days ago.
Was it this one or this one?
No, that one. And curiously, it got a lot of likes. I wonder why. It's like most of my Instagram pictures get like an average of like 50 to 60 likes, and that somehow wound up with 500. I'm just saying.
Her hair looks great in it.
Yeah, obviously that's it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's not end the stream on that note. But yeah, just the final thoughts on the film before we close out.
I the most interesting parts of the film for me were the discussions about psychoanalysis because I have read so much about it. It's nice to kind of see the founders being portrayed on screen. So I really did appreciate the dialogue itself, and we've talked about its origins being, adapted from a screenplay. So obviously the dialogue is the main thing in that medium. But I do want to reiterate what I kind of said in the beginning, which is that it would have been nice to have more of a focus on Sabina's kind of struggles through grad school, because she would have still been dealing with some mental issues and some PTSD from the abuse of her father, and so it would have been nice to have seen her growth in something that wasn't just sexual, even though obviously a lot of her problems stemmed from sexuality. I do think that she was not just saved by getting some from Jung, I think, and coming under her own as a sexual being. I think it was also the careful study of psychology and those quiet moments that we have as a grad student where we kind of have little epiphanies here and there when we're studying that also
actually it's one other thing I did want to bring up. There's a moment, and this is kind of the blending of both of those things, where the scene, later on in the film, when they think that they're going to be professional and stuff, and then it cuts to a scene where they're anything but. But the fact that she's watching herself in the mirror at that point, initially I took that as, she's turned on by that, and that's what we should draw from that. But actually, according to Cronenberg, what it is rather is that she's actually studying herself in that moment. She's going to actually use that in her studies as sort of, documenting, she's actually observing herself during that moment, which I found an interesting way to look at that.
Yeah, and to answer your question, Kate, about a final score, if you look at it as a story about Sabina, it's like a 6.5 or a 7 for me. But if you look at it as a story about Freud and Jung and psychoanalysis, it's like an 8 or an 8.5. But I wanted it to be about Sabina. That's my main thing. So because it was focused so much more on the men, if it was, this is about psychoanalysis and the founding of it, then I would put an 8. But if you wanted a Sabina movie, it's more like a 7 for me.
And that's interesting because I wouldn't have objected in the least bit to something that was more focused solely on Sabina, but I do tend to look at films for what they are and less for maybe what I would have liked to see. I see this film as telling the story of the interpersonal relationships between Sabina, Jung, and Freud, and so I kind of looked at it that way. And I don't want to necessarily give a score to it because it's just not really something that I do, but I will say that this was one of my top 5 films of the year that came out. So I do hold it in very high regard. But yeah, then that's what I'll say. I do continue to be angry that there weren't more nominations for this film, especially for Keira. I think she was, screwed out of many nominations over the years, and this for this film especially. So I keep going on about how I don't care about awards anymore, but I continue to get mad. So
come on, just when you think you're out, they keep pulling you back in, John.
Yeah. So
you're a cinephile. That's the way it is.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, like, when you look at it, she's only gotten 2 Academy Award nominations.
Criminal.
And that was for Pride and Prejudice and for Best Supporting Actress for the Imitation Game. Which, she delivered a great performance in that. But when you look at her body of work, it's not nearly one of her most impressive performances. I think she's great in it, and I'm glad she got the nomination. But if you consider performances like what she did for the Duchess, for Colette, which, by the way, didn't get any nominations at all, which is also criminal. yeah, I'm just pissed off about it.
Well, and you know how I feel about actor and actress categories. I don't like that men and women can't compete against each other. So I think the awards are sexist stupidness altogether. What if someone's playing a non-binary character? What if they're a trans character? Where do you put them?
Which, by the way, there was a line said by Sabina in this film, which I really wanted to highlight because it seemed incredibly like ahead of its time. And I loved that it was said. Let me find where I wrote it. Okay, where Jung says usually it's the man who should take the initiative, which is its own thing. And she says, "Don't you think there's something male in every woman and female in every man, or should be?" I love that line. I just think that it was, that's something that you wouldn't have expected to hear from the time period. And I do actually wonder.
And it was, and actually I messaged you this when we were watching, which is like two Westerners unknowingly discussing yin yang theory. Like that's exactly part of that. But yeah, yeah, exactly, Leaf. But yeah, I got to get to game night. So let's wrap this up, John.
Oh, fine. I was trying to trick you into going for another hour.
I mean, this is the right movie to do it with because I could keep talking about the P word for another 2 hours, but we got to save our energy for Mean Girls next time. So
yeah, which we'll be able to go on for 3 hours for that one. I see how it is. But yeah, we'll see. I know that you make sure you keep your schedule open for the X-Men stream because we're.
Oh yeah, trust me.
That's going to go on for a really long time.
Yeah, I'm ready for that.
So yeah, I love this film. I think I liked it a lot more than many people did when it came out. Which I'm not going to claim I had no bias. but I do wish it had gotten more attention, and I am gonna sort of cry sexism on the whole thing where Viggo got a lot of awards attention and Keira didn't.
Yeah.
Like, really? And I say that as someone who loves Viggo Mortensen. I think he's absolutely brilliant. He deserved the accolades coming his way. It's just Keira should have gotten them too. So yeah. We're gonna have a blast. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
YouTube will literally just crash. It'll be like 8 hours in, and it'll be like, this is against our user policy. No marathoning unless it's for charity. All right, let's wrap it up.
So I'll just wrap up by saying, once again, next week we've got Mean Girls, which Kate will be on for, and the week after that we have X-Men with Kelly and Jenna, and the week after that Pan's Labyrinth with Cecilia and Steven. So our wonderfully fun month continues, and January is honestly, it's been a crappy January so far in other areas, but as far as our channel, we're having a lot of fun.
We're having a blast this January. Yeah. And I'll just quickly throw my stuff up there. Check me out, youtube.com/Amy Blackfire. If you try to search me, it will change it to Army Blackfire and it won't let you find my channel. So please use the URL. That's the best way to do it. It's in the description. And there's my blog if you want to check it out. Like I said, lots of stuff coming up. I won't throw it at you again, but please check out my content. Follow me on Twitter. I think I'm a fun follow. I am Amy Poehler, Poller. I poll you. What is your opinion? Let me know. That's what I do.
And, I'll go ahead and be, sort of, selfish at this moment. Just say, give me a follow while you're at it, because I would love to have some more followers on Twitter. God, wow.
Yeah, well, I don't understand how you have so many more views than me, but I have more followers on Twitter. Like, what is this?
Yeah, I don't know. You'll find all of our information in the description, so just go ahead and check all that stuff out. And once more, I just want to put up these links for the Knights of Keira. Go ahead and follow us. And our next Night of Keira stream will be Pirates of the Caribbean. We'll have lots of fun doing that.
Yes.
So thank you once again for everybody stopping by. This was a lot of fun. We had some great conversation, and I'm glad and I'm sure Kelly is happy because we did just drop any semblance of an outline, and we just went for it. So I think that worked out beautifully.
That's how we do on Joe-Off.
Yeah. Okay, guys. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and please come by next week and check out some of our other videos.
Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, all the YouTube things.
All right, and that'll do it. Everybody have a wonderful night, and we'll see you next time.